A part of the Ukrainian population collaborated with the Germans during the Second World War. When the Germans invaded the USSR on the 22nd of June 1941, many Ukrainians greeted the Germans as liberators. Some of them were even willing to join the Germans in their fight against the USSR, in units such as the Nachtigall Battalion and SS Galicia. In this video, I will talk about the pro-German Ukrainian units during the Second World War. Where did they fight and what were their reasons to join the Germans? Keep watching. Hey, good to have you back on the channel. If you're new, I'm Stefan, I'm a Dutch history teacher and I'm hustling history for you. And if you like that, consider subscribing, and if you want to support me, you can do so via PayPal and via Patreon. The links are in the description. When the Second World War came around, Ukraine had a troublesome history to say the least. In 1917, the Russian Revolution took place. After the February Revolution, the Ukrainian Rada proclaimed itself loyal to the provisional government that had taken office. However, after the Bolshevik coup, also known as the October Revolution, near the end of that year, Ukraine proclaimed its independence and was now known as the Ukrainian People's Republic. However, the Bolsheviks, they set up their rival communist government in the East Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. Then there was also another Ukrainian state that was being proclaimed in the city of Lviv, in Polish known as Lvov. I'm talking about the West Ukrainian People's Republic. Now, this consisted of the territories that previously belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had by now crumbled. The thing was that these territories were also claimed by Poland, and the Poles, they eventually proclaimed victory, and thus the West Ukrainian People's Republic was no more. The Ukrainian People's Republic in Kiev, that one was taken down by the Bolsheviks. Now, this was a simplified version. It was basically part of the Russian Civil War, or to be more precise, the Ukrainian War of Independence, which left Ukraine not independent. I made a detailed episode about this conflict. If you want to learn more about it, see the link in the top right corner. The majority of the Ukrainians, they ended up under Bolshevik rule. In the 1930s, Stalin, he created a man-made famine in which millions of Ukrainians perished, and then more perished during the Stalinist purges later that decade. Ukrainian nationalism was the most prevalent in the western part of the country, and that part was now part of the Second Polish Republic. In 1929, the OUN, the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists, was established with their slogan, Ukraine for Ukrainians. The OUN, they saw violence as a legitimate means to reach their goal. They committed assassination attempts on Polish politicians. Also, moderate Ukrainians were targeted by them. And this provoked the Polish pacifications of Ukrainians in 1930, where the Polish authorities tried to weed out Ukrainian nationalism. Now, violence was used for sure. There is a debate on how much violence was used and how many Ukrainians were killed. Polish sources state none, Ukrainian sources state many. Because of these Polish pacifications, the OUN radicalized even further. Then it was 1939. In that year, the Second Polish Republic ceased to exist because on the 1st of September that year, the Germans invaded Poland from the west. And sometime later, the Soviets did so via the east. They agreed upon this via the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was signed 1 month prior. So the western part of Ukraine that was part of southeastern Poland, that was now part of the USSR. So therefore Ukraine became united. The OUN had to lay low because many Ukrainian nationalists were deported or executed by the Soviet Secret Service, the NKVD. In 1940, a split occurred within the OUN. From now on, there was the more moderate wing led by Andrei Melnik, known as the OUN-M, and the more radical wing led by Stepan Bandera, known as the OUN-B. In the meanwhile, in German-occupied Poland, two pro-German Ukrainian units were set up, the Nachtigall and the Roland Battalion. On the 22nd of June, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, the full-scale invasion of the USSR. On the 30th, German troops, they arrived at Lemberg, also known as Lvov, also known as Lviv. Among them was the Roland Battalion and Stepan Bandera. The Germans actually forbade him to come. I mean, he had to stay put in German-occupied Poland, but he did come anyway. And on that day, he issued the Act on the Restoration of the Ukrainian State, in which he proclaimed the founding of the Ukrainian state, for which whole generations of the best sons of Ukraine laid down their lives. The newly established Ukrainian state will collaborate closely with National Socialist Greater Germany, which, under the direction of its leader Adolf Hitler, is creating a new order in Europe and the world, and is helping the Ukrainian people to free itself from Moscow's occupation. Stepan Bandera, he had hoped for a similar situation that had occurred in former Yugoslavia. See, the Axis, they invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941, and shortly after, an independent state of Croatia, which wasn't really independent, was proclaimed. Now, Stepan Bandera's plan totally backfired, since the Germans, they were like, nope. And they interned Stepan Bandera, and he remained in German captivity for the rest of the war. The majority of Ukraine became known as the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. The southwestern part was occupied by the Romanians, and the western part of Ukraine, that used to be known as the eastern part of Poland, became part of German-occupied Poland. I'm talking about the general government. It basically became an extension of the general government. The Reichskommissariat came under the rule of ardent Nazi Erich Koch, who stated, "I am known as a brutal dog. Our job is to suck from the Ukraine all the goods we can get hold of. I am expecting from you the utmost severity towards the native population," as he spoke to his subordinates. As the Germans secured Lvov, Lviv, Lemberg, they discovered thousands of slaughtered political inmates, both Ukrainian and Polish, that were slaughtered by the Soviet Secret Service, the NKVD, before they had retreated. Building on the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, the Jews of the city bore the brunt as the Lviv pogrom kicked off, in which Ukrainian nationalists, among which the Roland Battalion, actively did take part in. As one survivor wrote in a testimony, "On orders from the Germans, the Ukrainian soldiers drew themselves up in two ranks and fixed their bayonets. All the Jews who had been in the prison yard were made to pass between these ranks, while the Ukrainian soldiers beat and stabbed them. By pure chance, I was not among the first who had to pass along the ranks. The first Jews who had to go through were almost all bayoneted." Now, the role of the OUNB and the National Battalion in this pogrom has been dismissed and underrated by many Ukrainian historians. Be aware of the fact that there were also Ukrainians who hit Jews, so it's definitely not true that all Ukrainians were anti-Semites. Later, the German Einsatzgruppe moved in, and the murders got a more systematic character. The survivors, they were put in the Lemberg ghetto, where many of them would die. In August 1941, the Nachtigall Battalion and the Roland Battalion were withdrawn and reorganized in Germany. Members continued to serve in the Schutzmannschaft Battalion 201, which had around 650 men. The formation had to conduct anti-partisan operations in German-occupied Belarus. When their one-year term of service expired, they were encouraged to re-enlist, and those who did not, they were arrested and interned. Now, some of them, they managed to escape, and they joined the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, in short, the UPA. Now, against who did the UPA fight? Well, I think it's easier to ask ourselves against who didn't they fight, because they basically fought against everyone, against Germans, the Soviets, the Polish underground, and later the Polish communist authorities. Because yes, they resisted for years after the war, but that's beyond the scope of this episode. One of the leaders was Roman Shukevich, who first commanded the Nachtigall Battalion, then Schutzmannschaft 102, and then the UPA. And then there were also other pro-German Ukrainian formations. Here they come. Ukrainian Auxiliary Police, Ukrainian Protection Police, Ukrainian Order Police, Local Self-Defense and Auxiliary Police, Self-Defense Bush Detachments, and special guard units. These all had to perform police tasks and guard duties. Some units had to take part in rooting out partisans. Many of these units doubled as units of the resistance network of the OUN. In 1943, the Waffen-SS was persuaded to deploy Ukrainian units. The idea was that Galician Ukrainians from the west, who had in the past been loyal to the Habsburg Emperor, could fill in the ranks. One condition was that these Ukrainians had to be of Greek Catholic faith and not Orthodox, like the East Ukrainians were. And so, the 14th SS Volunteer Division Galicia saw the light of day. From 1944, this formation was known as the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS. The Ukrainian Liberation Army, the UVV, was the collective name for all Ukrainian units serving with the German army during World War II. Eventually, the Germans did recognize Ukrainian independence. Wow, how benevolent. By now it was March 1945, the Germans were pushed out of Ukraine and the Soviets had re-established their rule. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian National Army was established that was led by Pavlo Shandruk. Shandruk, he insisted that the 14th SS Division should also be part of his force, which happened and was being retitled the 1st Ukrainian Division, as the 2nd Ukrainian Division was put together from scattered UVV units. Some sources state that this army had around 250,000 men. And then there were also Ukrainians that served alongside Russians and Belarusians as Hiwis or in the security units or the ROA, the Russian Liberation Army. Arms and equipment were German throughout, apart from some captured weaponry, and I read that the initial units wore Czech uniforms. They later adopted German uniforms and equipment. The auxiliary units wore different uniforms. Some wore German field gray uniforms, others German police green-gray uniforms, others black uniforms, others Red Army uniforms, and others they just had civilian clothing with an armband. The SS Galicia had a Galician line on the right collar patch. The UVV units wore a mixture of insignia. Now, there were plans to design uniforms for the UVV, and they wanted to model these on uniforms from the early 1920s during the Ukrainian War of Independence, but because the end of the war was coming, these plans weren't carried out. As said before, the Ukrainian auxiliary units performed static guard duties. Some units fought against partisans in Belarus. Other units fought against the Soviets when the Axis retreated from Ukraine. Mid-1944, the 14th SS Division Galicia was almost completely destroyed when fighting at Brody. The UNA saw action in Austria and Czechoslovakia, but this was in the last weeks of the war. During the German occupation of Ukraine, the Ukrainian auxiliaries took an active role in the killings of Jewish people in the Soviet Union. Some Ukrainians served at extermination camps such as Sobibor. Also later in the war, radicalized members of the UPA, they targeted ethnic Poles in eastern Galicia and Volhynia, and it's estimated that 50 to 100,000 Poles were slaughtered by the radicalized Ukrainian nationalists. Near the end of the war, most of the pro-German Ukrainian units were captured by the Western Allies. According to the Yalta Agreement, they had to be repatriated. High-ranking officers were then shot by the Soviets, and others were deported to the Gulag, where many of them would die. Not all were repatriated. UNA commander Pavlo Shandruk, he managed to escape, and he died in 1979 in the United States. Do understand that most Ukrainians in the end fought for the Soviets. 4.5 million Ukrainians served either in the Red Army or served as Soviet partisans behind the front line. So therefore, it is unjust to state that all Ukrainians were collaborators. They were not. Some saw the Germans as liberators initially, but most of them knew really quickly that the Germans were just new, brutal occupiers who saw the Ukrainians as indispensable people. How many Ukrainians died at the hands of the Germans will probably never be known. Many farmers were just hanged by the Germans to make an example. As Richard Overy wrote, thousands of peasants were hanged or shot for suspected partisan activity. Throughout the Ukraine, 250 villages and their populations were deliberately obliterated to encourage good behavior. in the rest. Tens of thousands more died in the cities of Kiev and Kharkiv because of starvation, because the Germans deliberately blocked the roads and prevented food being imported to the cities. And as the Germans retreated from Ukraine, they applied a scorched earth policy in which countless of settlements were razed to the ground. Anything that was considered as valuable for the pursuing Red Army was either taken away or destroyed. Yes, Soviet rule was brutal. Yes, the Holodomor was a genocide that was carried out by Stalin and his henchmen and should never be forgotten. So were his decolonization policies, and so was his Great Purge. But so was Nazi rule, in which millions and millions of Ukrainians died. And more Ukrainians continued to die. As the Soviets reestablished their rule, countless of Ukrainians, collaborators or not, were deported on Stalin's orders. The UPA continued to resist till the 1950s. Life became more bearable for the Ukrainians and for the other Soviet people after Stalin's death in 1953. Big shout out to my patrons: Philip Jordan, Jakob Musland, Nick Taranova, Haley Barre, Mark Littlehale, Janusz Jonjankiewicz, Joanne Kekoa, Justin Trebell, Peter King, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rob Park, Andrea Martic, Vasily P. Campbell, and Fernando Lopez Ojeda. Click here for more on Ukrainian history and here for more on non-German Axis formations. Thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to subscribe. I'll see you later.